The morning mist hung heavy over the grounds of Clarence House as Thomas Mitchell adjusted his ceremonial uniform one final time. 23 years of loyal service to the crown had taught him to notice the smallest details that others might miss. As a senior member of the Royal Protection Squad, Thomas had witnessed countless private moments, family celebrations, and quiet sorrows that would never make headlines. Today felt different, though he couldn't quite explain why. The autumn of 2023 had been particularly challenging for the royal family. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, had been dealing with what palace officials diplomatically called personal matters regarding some missing jewelry pieces. The media had caught wind of the story weeks earlier, though the full details remained carefully guarded. Thomas knew more than most about the situation, having been present during several tense discussions between palace officials and insurance investigators. Queen Camilla had been staying at Clarence House more frequently since the jewelry incident came to light. Her usual composed demeanor seemed slightly strained during recent weeks, though she maintained her public duties with characteristic grace. Thomas had noticed small changes in her routine: longer private phone calls, more frequent visits from her personal assistant, and an unusual interest in the household staff schedules. The missing jewelry belonged to Catherine and included several pieces of significant historical and sentimental value. Among them was a diamond brooch that had belonged to Princess Diana, a pearl necklace gifted by Queen Elizabeth II during Catherine's engagement to Prince William, and a sapphire bracelet that matched her famous engagement ring. The items had been discovered missing from Catherine's private jewelry collection during a routine inventory check before a state dinner. Palace security had conducted a thorough but discreet investigation. Every staff member with access to the private quarters had been interviewed. Security footage had been reviewed frame by frame. The investigation had yielded few concrete leads, though whispers among the household staff suggested various theories about what might have happened to the precious items. Thomas remembered the day Catherine first noticed the missing pieces. He had been stationed outside her private sitting room when her lady-in-waiting emerged looking distressed. Through the partially open door, he could hear Catherine's voice, usually so calm and measured, carrying notes of genuine upset and confusion. The princess had immediately contacted palace security, insisting that the matter be handled with absolute discretion to avoid any public scandal. The relationship between Catherine and Camilla had always been cordial but somewhat formal. Both women understood their roles within the complex hierarchy of royal life, but they came from different generations and had different approaches to royal duty. Camilla's path to acceptance within the royal family had been long and difficult, marked by years of public scrutiny and gradual rehabilitation of her image. Catherine, by contrast, had been welcomed more readily, though she too faced intense media attention and public expectations. In recent months, Thomas had observed subtle tensions during family gatherings. Nothing dramatic or obvious, but small signs that suggested not everything was perfectly harmonious behind palace walls. Camilla would sometimes make comments that seemed to carry double meanings. Catherine would occasionally excuse herself early from informal family meals. Prince William appeared more protective of his wife than usual during public appearances. The missing jewelry investigation had created an atmosphere of suspicion that affected everyone in the royal household. Staff members found themselves under scrutiny. Long-serving employees felt hurt that their loyalty was being questioned. The usually smooth operation of royal life became somewhat strained as security protocols were tightened and access to private areas became more restricted. Thomas had worked closely with Detective Inspector Sarah Williams, who had been assigned to lead the discreet investigation into the missing jewelry. Inspector Williams was known for her professionalism and her ability to handle sensitive cases involving high-profile individuals. She had interviewed dozens of people connected to the royal household, from senior courtiers to cleaning staff, but the mystery remained unsolved. The insurance companies involved were growing impatient for resolution. The missing pieces were worth several £1 million, but their historical significance made them truly irreplaceable. Lloyd's of London had assigned their best investigators to work alongside Scotland Yard's Specialist Protection Unit, but even their combined expertise had failed to uncover solid leads. Prince William had taken the situation particularly seriously, not just because of the monetary value of the missing items, but because of their emotional significance to his wife. The Diana brooch held special meaning for Catherine, who had worn it on several important occasions as a way of honoring her late mother-in-law's memory. The loss of such personally meaningful items had affected Catherine deeply, though she tried to hide her distress from public view. King Charles had been informed of the situation but had chosen to remain somewhat removed from the day-to-day investigation. His position required him to balance family loyalty with institutional integrity, a delicate task that had become increasingly complex as the investigation continued without resolution. Palace officials briefed him regularly on progress, but he generally left operational decisions to his security team and senior courtiers. The media had begun asking questions, though palace press officers had successfully deflected most inquiries with vague statements about routine security reviews and insurance updates. A few persistent royal correspondents continued to probe, sensing that there was more to the story than official statements suggested. The palace's communication strategy involved controlled releases of information designed to satisfy media curiosity without revealing sensitive details. Thomas had noticed changes in household routines since the investigation began. Certain areas of the royal residences that had previously been accessible to trusted staff were now off-limits. New security cameras had been installed in corridors and common areas. Staff movements were tracked more carefully, and temporary visitors required additional clearance before being admitted to private quarters. The strain of the situation was beginning to show on various members of the royal family. Catherine maintained her public composure but seemed more reserved during private moments. Prince William appeared tense during recent public engagements, though he continued to fulfill his duties with professional dedication. Even the usually unflappable palace staff seemed somewhat on edge as the investigation dragged on without clear resolution. Queen Camilla continued her regular schedule of public appearances and charitable activities, but Thomas noticed that she seemed distracted during private moments. Her usual easy conversation with household staff had become more formal and brief. She spent more time in her private apartments and less time in the communal areas where she might encounter other family members or staff casually. The investigation had also affected relationships between different branches of the royal household. Staff members who had worked together harmoniously for years began viewing each other with suspicion. The atmosphere of trust that was essential for the smooth operation of royal life had been damaged, perhaps irreparably. Some long-serving employees had privately expressed their hurt feelings about being treated as potential suspects. Detective Inspector Williams had explained to Thomas that jewelry theft cases involving high-profile victims often proved particularly challenging to solve. The items were usually too distinctive to sell through normal channels, which meant they either ended up in private collections or were broken down for their component materials. The emotional attachment victims felt to stolen jewelry often made these cases especially sensitive to handle. As Thomas completed his morning security briefing, he reflected on how the missing jewelry case had changed the atmosphere within the royal household. What had begun as a straightforward investigation into missing property had evolved into something more complex, touching on relationships, loyalty, and trust within one of the world's most scrutinized families. The resolution, when it came, would likely have implications far beyond the simple recovery of stolen items. The autumn sun was beginning to break through the morning clouds as Thomas prepared for another day of vigilant service. He had no idea that within a few hours, a chance discovery would transform the missing jewelry case into something far more dramatic and personally challenging than anyone could have imagined. The truth, when it emerged, would test loyalties, challenge assumptions, and force difficult questions about trust and family relationships within the royal household. The discovery that would change everything happened on a crisp Tuesday morning in late October. Thomas was conducting his usual security rounds when he encountered young Frederick Parker Bowles, Queen Camilla's 8-year-old grandson, playing in the garden maze at Clarence House. Frederick was the son of Tom Parker Bowles, Camilla's eldest child, and was visiting his grandmother for the school half-term holiday. Frederick was an energetic boy who reminded Thomas of Prince George at that age, though perhaps more mischievous. The child had been staying at Clarence House for 3 days, enjoying the attention of household staff who found his youthful enthusiasm a welcome break from the usual formal atmosphere. Thomas had often seen Frederick exploring the extensive gardens, always supervised by either his grandmother or a trusted member of staff. On this particular morning, Frederick was playing alone near the ornamental fountain, building small towers from fallen autumn leaves and tossing pebbles into the water. Thomas approached to ensure the boy wasn't in any danger, as the fountain's edge could be slippery when wet. As they chatted about Frederick's leaf construction project, the boy reached into his jacket pocket to retrieve what he described as his special treasure collection. What Frederick pulled from his pocket made Thomas's blood run cold. Among the typical contents of a young boy's pocket, smooth pebbles, a few coins, and some wrapped sweets, were 3 pieces of jewelry that Thomas immediately recognized. The diamond brooch that had belonged to Princess Diana caught the light as Frederick held it up proudly. The sapphire bracelet wrapped around his small fingers like an oversized decoration. The pearl necklace was carefully coiled in his palm, protected by a soft handkerchief. Thomas struggled to maintain his composure as Frederick began explaining how his grandmother had given him these pretty things to look after. The boy spoke with innocent pride about his special responsibility, completely unaware of the significance of what he possessed. According to Frederick, Queen Camilla had entrusted him with these treasures during his first evening at Clarence's house, telling him they were very special and that he must keep them safe. Granny said these belonged to someone who couldn't take proper care of them, Frederick explained with the earnest seriousness that only children can muster. She said I'm much more responsible and that I should keep them until she decides what to do with them. She made me promise not to tell anyone else because it's our special secret. Thomas felt his heart racing as he processed this information. The missing jewelry that had sparked weeks of investigation, stress, and suspicion was in the innocent hands of a child who believed he was helping his grandmother. The implications were staggering and potentially devastating for Queen Camilla's reputation and position within the royal family. Thinking quickly, Thomas complimented Frederick on his responsibility while carefully photographing the jewelry with his discreet security phone. He explained that he needed to speak with Queen Camilla about security arrangements and suggested that Frederick might want to return the jewelry to his grandmother's safekeeping while they were talking. The boy readily agreed, though he seemed reluctant to give up his treasures. Thomas escorted Frederick back to Clarence's house, his mind racing with the implications of what he had discovered. Queen Camilla was in her morning room, reviewing correspondence with her private secretary. When Thomas requested an urgent private word, she initially seemed annoyed at the interruption but agreed to see him immediately when she noticed his serious expression. The confrontation that followed was unlike anything Thomas had experienced in his years of royal service. When he quietly explained what Frederick had shown him, Queen Camilla's carefully composed facade cracked completely. Her face went pale, her hands trembled slightly, and, for several moments she seemed unable to speak. When she finally found her voice, her words came in a rush of explanations and justifications. According to Camilla, she had taken the jewelry during a private visit to Kensington Palace several weeks earlier. She claimed that Catherine had been careless with the precious items, leaving them unsecured in areas where household staff could access them. Camilla insisted that her actions were motivated by genuine concern for the safety of historically significant pieces that belonged not just to Catherine personally, but to the institution of the monarchy itself. I was protecting them, Camilla said, her voice shaking with emotion. Catherine leaves these priceless pieces lying around like costume jewelry. The Diana brooch was sitting on her dressing table where any maid could see it. The pearls were draped over a chair. She has no understanding of their historical significance or their proper security requirements. Thomas listened with growing amazement as Queen Camilla justified her actions. She spoke about her years of experience with royal protocol, her deep understanding of the monarchy's history, and her responsibility to protect precious artifacts for future generations. She seemed genuinely convinced that she had acted appropriately, even heroically, in securing the jewelry from what she characterized as Catherine's negligent care. The revelation about Frederick's involvement had clearly caught Camilla off guard. She admitted that she had given the boy the jewelry for safekeeping during a moment of panic when she heard that security teams were conducting searches of staff quarters. She had thought that hiding the items with Frederick would be temporary, just until the investigation cooled down, but had not anticipated how proudly the child would display his treasures. I never meant for this to go so far, Camilla said, beginning to pace around her morning room. The investigation should have been called off weeks ago. Catherine should have been more careful with her inventory. This whole situation has been blown completely out of proportion. Thomas found himself in an impossible position. His loyalty to the crown required him to report criminal activity, yet the person involved was Queen Camilla herself. The jewelry clearly belonged to Catherine, and taking it without permission constituted theft regardless of the motivations involved. Yet accusing the queen consort of theft would create a scandal that could damage the monarchy itself. As they talked, Frederick appeared in the doorway, having retrieved the jewelry from his bedroom as Thomas had suggested. The sight of the innocent child holding the stolen items seemed to crystallize the seriousness of the situation for Queen Camilla. She gathered Frederick in her arms, gently taking the jewelry while explaining that their special secret game needed to end now. "I'll take care of these from now on," she told her grandson, who looked disappointed to lose his treasures. "You've been a very good helper, but I think it's time for these pretty things to go back to their proper home." After Frederick left the room, Thomas and Queen Camilla continued their tense conversation. She begged him to understand her perspective, emphasizing that she had acted out of genuine concern rather than malicious intent. She spoke about the pressure she felt to prove herself worthy of her role as queen consort, and how seeing Catherine treat precious royal artifacts casually had triggered her protective instincts. "I've spent years earning my place in this family," Camilla said, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "I understand the weight of history in ways that Catherine never will. These pieces represent something bigger than personal jewelry collections. They're part of our national heritage." Thomas recognized that Queen Camilla genuinely believed in her justifications, which somehow made the situation even more complex. Her actions constituted theft by any legal definition, yet her motivations seemed to stem from an exaggerated sense of duty rather than personal greed. The psychological complexity of the situation was far beyond anything he had encountered in his security career. The immediate question facing Thomas was what to do with his knowledge. Reporting the discovery would trigger a massive scandal that could seriously damage the monarchy's reputation. Queen Camilla could face criminal charges, public disgrace, and possible removal from her position. The revelation that she had involved an innocent child in concealing stolen property would add another layer of public outrage. Yet failing to report the theft would make Thomas complicit in covering up a serious crime. His oath of service required integrity and honesty, principles that seemed to conflict with protecting the institution he served. Detective Inspector Williams and her team were still actively investigating the case, interviewing suspects and following leads that could implicate innocent staff members. As their conversation continued, Queen Camilla began proposing various solutions. She suggested quietly returning the jewelry to Catherine's collection with some plausible explanation for their sudden reappearance. She offered to claim that she had temporarily borrowed the items for a security assessment and simply forgot to inform anyone. She even suggested that Frederick might have taken them innocently during a visit to Kensington Palace. Each proposed solution seemed worse than honest disclosure. Thomas realized that Queen Camilla was now asking him to participate actively in covering up her theft rather than simply remaining silent about it. The ethical lines were becoming increasingly clear, despite the complex personal and institutional relationships involved. The morning sun had given way to overcast skies by the time their conversation reached its conclusion. Queen Camilla sat heavily in her favorite armchair, the recovered jewelry spread on the table before her like evidence at a crime scene. Thomas stood by the window, weighing his options while watching Frederick play innocently in the garden below, unaware that his childhood visit had uncovered one of the most potentially damaging scandals in modern royal history. The weight of his discovery pressed heavily on Thomas's shoulders as he prepared to make decisions that would affect not just Queen Camilla and Catherine, but the entire royal family and the institution they all served. The simple theft of jewelry had evolved into a complex web of relationships, loyalties, and competing obligations that would test everyone involved in ways they could never have imagined. Thomas spent the next 48 hours in a state of mental torment unlike anything he had experienced in his distinguished career. The weight of his discovery about Queen Camilla and the missing jewelry created an impossible conflict between his personal loyalty to the royal family and his professional obligation to uphold justice. Sleep became elusive as he wrestled with the implications of each possible course of action. His first instinct was to contact Detective Inspector Williams immediately. The investigation into Catherine's missing jewelry had consumed significant resources and had created an atmosphere of suspicion that was damaging relationships throughout the royal household. Several innocent staff members remained under scrutiny, their reputations and careers potentially at risk because of the ongoing investigation. From a purely legal perspective, Thomas knew that concealing evidence of a crime could make him an accessory after the fact. Yet the potential consequences of revealing Queen Camilla's involvement seemed catastrophic. The monarchy had weathered numerous scandals over the decades, but a sitting queen consort accused of theft from the Princess of Wales would create unprecedented constitutional and public relations challenges. The media feeding frenzy would be relentless, potentially overwhelming any other royal news for months or even years. Thomas found himself analyzing every detail of his conversation with Queen Camilla, searching for alternative interpretations that might somehow justify her actions or minimize their severity. Her passionate defense of her motives had clearly been sincere, even if profoundly misguided. She genuinely believed that Catherine was failing to properly protect historically significant artifacts, and her actions stemmed from institutional loyalty rather than personal gain. The involvement of young Frederick added another layer of ethical complexity to the situation. The 8-year-old boy had been manipulated into concealing stolen property, though he remained completely innocent of any wrongdoing. Queen Camilla's decision to involve her grandson demonstrated either remarkable desperation or concerning judgment about appropriate boundaries between family relationships and criminal activity. During his off-duty hours, Thomas found himself walking the streets of London, trying to clear his head while weighing his options. The city's historical sites reminded him constantly of the monarchy's deep roots in British culture and identity. Westminster Abbey, Buckingham Palace, and the Tower of London represented centuries of royal tradition that could be damaged by the scandal he now carried knowledge of. He thought about his own family history of service to the crown. His grandfather had served as a royal protection officer during World War II, his father had been a palace guardsman for 30 years, and Thomas himself had dedicated his adult life to royal service. The idea of being responsible for damaging the institution his family had served for generations created profound emotional conflict. Yet Thomas also thought about the innocent staff members who remained under investigation. Mrs. Elizabeth Hartley, a housekeeper with 25 years of loyal service, had been subjected to multiple interviews and background checks. James Morrison, a young footman who was saving money to marry his longtime girlfriend, lived in fear that the ongoing investigation might cost him his position. Their stress and uncertainty weighed heavily on Thomas's conscience. The practical challenges of coming forward were equally daunting. Thomas would need to explain how he had discovered the jewelry and why he had waited to report it. His credibility might be questioned if it appeared that he had given Queen Camilla time to prepare her defense or dispose of evidence. The timing of his revelation could be seen as suspicious by investigators who had been working the case for weeks. Detective Inspector Williams had established a good working relationship with Thomas during the investigation. She respected his professionalism and had often sought his insights about royal household dynamics and security protocols. Thomas knew she would handle sensitive information appropriately, but he also understood that once he shared his discovery, the situation would quickly spiral beyond anyone's control. Thomas decided to seek guidance from his superior, Commander Robert Green, who oversaw royal protection operations. Commander Green was a veteran of 35 years in royal security and had navigated numerous sensitive situations involving the royal family. If anyone could provide wisdom about how to handle this unprecedented dilemma, it would be Commander Green. Their conversation took place in Commander Green's private office at Scotland Yard, away from the palace environment where conversations might be overheard. Thomas presented the facts carefully, explaining his discovery of the jewelry with Frederick and his subsequent conversation with Queen Camilla. Commander Green listened without interruption, his expression growing more grave as the story unfolded. "This is exactly the kind of situation we train for but hope never to encounter," Commander Green said after Thomas finished his account. The conflict between institutional loyalty and legal obligation is precisely why these cases are so challenging for everyone involved. Commander Green explained that similar dilemmas had arisen periodically throughout royal history, though rarely with such potential for public scandal. The royal family's privileged position in society came with both benefits and burdens, including the expectation that they would be held to higher standards of conduct than ordinary citizens. "The question isn't whether Queen Camilla committed theft," Commander Green observed. "The evidence you've described makes that clear. The question is how to handle that knowledge in a way that serves justice while minimizing damage to the institution we're sworn to protect." They discussed various options, each with significant drawbacks. Reporting the theft immediately would trigger a formal investigation that could become public quickly. The media would inevitably learn about the charges, creating a feeding frenzy that could dominate news cycles for months. Queen Camilla might face criminal prosecution, though her status would complicate any legal proceedings. Alternatively, they could approach the situation more diplomatically, perhaps arranging for the jewelry to be quietly returned to Catherine with some face-saving explanation. This approach might avoid public scandal but would leave innocent staff members under suspicion and could be seen as covering up criminal activity by senior officials. Commander Green also raised the possibility of involving senior palace officials or even King Charles himself before taking any formal action. The monarch's position above politics and law enforcement might allow for a resolution that protected both justice and institutional integrity, though it would place enormous pressure on the king to choose between family loyalty and legal obligation. Whatever we decide, Commander Green emphasized, we need to act quickly. The longer we delay, the more complicated the situation becomes and the more our own credibility is at risk. Thomas left the meeting with Commander Green feeling somewhat clearer about his options but no less burdened by the weight of his decision. The clock was ticking, and Detective Inspector Williams was continuing her investigation with increasing intensity. Recent interviews with staff members had become more pointed, suggesting that investigators were growing frustrated with their lack of progress. That evening, Thomas received an unexpected phone call from Queen Camilla herself. She had clearly been thinking about their conversation and wanted to discuss the situation further. Her tone was different from their face-to-face meeting, more calculating and less emotional. She seemed to have spent the intervening time developing a more sophisticated defense of her actions. "I've been thinking about our conversation," Queen Camilla said, her voice carefully controlled. "I realize that you have a job to do, Thomas, and I respect your position. But I hope you'll consider the bigger picture here. Catherine's carelessness with these precious items could have resulted in their permanent loss. My intervention, however unconventional, prevented that disaster." Queen Camilla went on to suggest that the missing jewelry incident could be resolved without involving law enforcement if Catherine could be persuaded to accept responsibility for her own negligence. She proposed a narrative in which Catherine would acknowledge that she had misplaced the items temporarily and that they had been recovered through normal security protocols. "Everyone wins with this approach," Queen Camilla argued. "Catherine learns to be more careful with precious artifacts, the jewelry is safely returned, the investigation ends, and the monarchy avoids unnecessary scandal. Sometimes discretion serves the greater good better than rigid adherence to procedure." Thomas found Queen Camilla's renewed confidence unsettling. Her willingness to continue manipulating the situation, even after being caught, suggested that she hadn't fully grasped the seriousness of her actions. The idea that Catherine should accept blame for Queen Camilla's theft struck Thomas as particularly unfair and morally questionable. After the phone call ended, Thomas realized that Queen Camilla was essentially asking him to become an active participant in covering up her crime rather than simply remaining silent about it. She wanted him to help construct and maintain a false narrative that would protect her reputation while potentially damaging Catherine's. This request crossed a line that Thomas couldn't ignore. The weight of responsibility felt heavier than ever as Thomas prepared for what would likely be a sleepless night. Detective Inspector Williams had scheduled interviews with several more staff members for the following day, and the pressure on innocent people was mounting. Meanwhile, Queen Camilla was attempting to orchestrate a cover-up that would require Thomas's cooperation to succeed. As he looked out at the lights of London from his apartment window, Thomas reflected on the oath he had taken when he began his career in royal protection. He had sworn to serve the crown with integrity, honor, and loyalty, but the current situation seemed to pit those values against each other in irreconcilable ways. The decision he made in the coming hours would define not only his own character but potentially the future of the monarchy itself. The truth, as Thomas had learned, was both simple and incredibly complex. Queen Camilla had stolen jewelry belonging to Catherine, but her motivations and the potential consequences of revealing that truth created moral and practical complications that no training had prepared him to handle. Tomorrow would bring another day of investigation, another day of innocent people under suspicion, and another day closer to a resolution that seemed impossible to achieve without causing significant damage to someone. Thomas closed his eyes and tried to imagine how he would explain his decision to his grandfather, whose service during wartime had required similar choices between competing loyalties and moral obligations. The weight of history and the hope for justice would soon force him to act, regardless of the personal and institutional costs involved. The decision came to Thomas in the early hours of Thursday morning as he stood in his kitchen making tea, watching the dawn break over London's skyline. The weight of sleepless nights and moral wrestling had crystallized into a clear understanding of what he needed to do. His oath of service demanded integrity above all else, and that meant bringing the truth to light regardless of the personal cost to himself or the institutional damage to the monarchy. Thomas knew he couldn't face Detective Inspector Williams with his revelation without first giving Queen Camilla one final opportunity to come forward voluntarily. Professional courtesy and basic human decency required that he warn her about his intentions, even though she might use that warning to further complicate the situation. He called Clarence House and requested an urgent meeting, indicating that it concerned the jewelry investigation. Queen Camilla agreed to see him immediately, perhaps sensing from his tone that something significant had shifted since their last conversation. When Thomas arrived at Clarence House, he found her in her private study, already dressed despite the early hour. Her appearance suggested that she too had spent a sleepless night contemplating the situation. "I've made my decision," Thomas said without preamble. "I'm going to inform Detective Inspector Williams about what I discovered. I wanted to give you the opportunity to come forward yourself before I take that step." Queen Camilla's reaction was immediate and intense. The careful composure she had maintained during their previous conversations cracked completely, revealing the desperation and fear she had been hiding beneath her confident exterior. Her face flushed with anger and disbelief as she processed Thomas's ultimatum. "You cannot be serious," she said, rising from her chair and moving to the window. "Do you have any idea what you're suggesting? The damage this would cause to the monarchy, to my reputation, to my relationship with my stepson? You would destroy decades of careful work to build public acceptance." Thomas remained calm but resolute as Queen Camilla continued her passionate defense. She paced around the room, gesticulating as she spoke, her voice rising with emotion. She reminded him of her years of service to the crown, her charitable work, her efforts to support King Charles during his transition to the throne. She spoke about the progress she had made in winning public affection after decades of negative publicity. "I've spent years proving myself worthy of this position," Queen Camilla said, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "Every public appearance, every charitable engagement, every family gathering has been an opportunity to show people that I belong in this family. Do you want to throw all of that away over a misunderstanding about some jewelry?" Thomas listened with sympathy but maintained his position. He explained that innocent staff members were suffering under suspicion, that Detective Inspector Williams's investigation was intensifying, and that the longer the truth remained hidden, the worse the eventual revelation would be. He pointed out that Queen Camilla's actions constituted clear theft regardless of her motivations, and that covering up the crime would only make matters worse. "Mrs. Hartley cried during her last interview," Thomas said quietly. 25 years of loyal service, and now she's being treated like a criminal suspect. James Morrison is considering resigning because he can't handle the stress of being investigated. These are good people whose lives are being damaged while we protect someone who committed an actual crime. Queen Camilla's response revealed the depth of her desperation and the extent to which she had rationalized her actions. She accused Thomas of disloyalty, of failing to understand the bigger picture, of being willing to damage the monarchy for the sake of abstract principles about truth and justice. She suggested that his years of service should have taught him the value of discretion and the importance of protecting the institution above individual concerns. "You're being naive about how the real world works," Queen Camilla argued. "Sometimes difficult decisions require us to prioritize institutional stability over technical legal requirements. The monarchy has survived for centuries because people like us know when to bend the rules for the greater good." Thomas found himself genuinely shocked by Queen Camilla's inability to accept responsibility for her actions. Her continued insistence that she had acted appropriately, combined with her willingness to let innocent people suffer for her crime, revealed a moral blindness that Thomas found deeply disturbing. The woman he had served and protected for years was showing a side of her character that he had never seen before. As their conversation continued, Queen Camilla's desperation led her to increasingly inappropriate attempts to influence Thomas's decision. She reminded him of his family's history of royal service, suggesting that his grandfather and father would be ashamed of his willingness to damage the monarchy. She implied that his career prospects would be severely damaged if he proceeded with his plan to reveal the truth. "Think about your future, Thomas," Queen Camilla said, her tone taking on a threatening quality. "Royal protection is a small world. Word gets around about officers who can't be trusted to show proper loyalty. Is your rigid interpretation of right and wrong worth destroying your own career?" Thomas recognized these tactics as attempts at intimidation and emotional manipulation. The fact that Queen Camilla was willing to threaten him personally further confirmed his belief that coming forward was the right decision. Her behavior showed a pattern of using whatever means necessary to protect herself, regardless of the impact on others. "I'm giving you until this afternoon to contact Detective Inspector Williams yourself," Thomas said finally. "If you choose to come forward voluntarily, you can control the narrative to some extent. You can explain your motivations and, perhaps, minimize the damage. But, if you don't, I'll be contacting her at 4 o'clock today." Queen Camilla's final attempt to dissuade Thomas involved an appeal to his emotions and his family loyalty. She spoke about the pain this revelation would cause King Charles, who had already endured decades of public scrutiny about his relationship with her. She mentioned the impact on Prince William and Catherine, who would have to navigate the public fallout from accusing the Queen Consort of theft. "Charles has been through enough," Queen Camilla said, her voice breaking. "He's finally found happiness and stability in his role as king. This scandal would overshadow everything positive he's trying to accomplish. Is that really what you want his reign to be remembered for?" Thomas felt the emotional weight of Queen Camilla's appeals, but he also recognized the manipulation involved in making him feel responsible for consequences that resulted from her choices rather than his. She had created the situation through her own actions, and now she was attempting to shift moral responsibility to him for the outcome of revealing the truth. As Thomas prepared to leave Clarence House, Queen Camilla made one final desperate plea. She offered to quietly return the jewelry to Catherine with a private apology, to make a substantial anonymous donation to Catherine's charitable causes, to accept whatever private punishment the family deemed appropriate. She begged Thomas to consider a resolution that would satisfy justice without destroying her public reputation. "I'll do anything you think is appropriate," Queen Camilla said, "but please don't destroy my life over this. I made a mistake, a serious mistake, but surely that doesn't mean everything else I've done should be forgotten." Thomas felt genuine sympathy for Queen Camilla's distress, but he also understood that private resolutions would leave important questions unanswered and potentially create precedents for covering up future misconduct. The rule of law required that crimes be addressed through proper channels, regardless of the social status of the people involved. "The choice is yours," Thomas said as he reached the door. "You can tell your story your way by coming forward voluntarily, or Detective Inspector Williams can hear it from me. Either way, the truth is going to come out." After leaving Clarence House, Thomas spent the remainder of the morning completing his regular duties while mentally preparing for what would likely be one of the most significant conversations of his career. Detective Inspector Williams would need to hear the complete story, including his own role in discovering the evidence and his delay in reporting it. The investigation that had seemed stalled for weeks was about to take a dramatic turn. Thomas thought about Queen Camilla's final words as he drove through London's streets. Her plea for mercy was understandable and even touching, but it didn't change the fundamental facts of what had happened. She had stolen valuable property, involved an innocent child in concealing the crime, and allowed numerous innocent people to suffer under investigation while she protected herself. The afternoon deadline approached with no word from Queen Camilla. Thomas Ha.